Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm here in my cozy little Minecraft world while we dive into some absolutely wild Reddit confession stories. I've got a collection of stories today that honestly made me question everything I thought I knew about human nature when I read through them. Some of these confessions are so bizarre, so grab whatever you're working on, get comfortable, and let's jump into some of the strangest confessions the internet has to offer. These stories are straight from various confession subreddits, and trust me, some of these people are carrying secrets that would make your jaw drop. Our first story comes from someone who discovered something disturbing about their roommate's daily routine. I've been living with my roommate David for about 8 months now, and I thought I knew everything about his habits. He's clean, pays rent on time, and generally keeps to himself. But last week I discovered something that's been keeping me up at night. David works from home as a freelance graphic designer, so he's usually in his room most of the day. I work a regular 9 to 5, so our schedules don't overlap much, except for evenings and weekends. Recently, I've been working from home more often due to a project deadline, which meant I was around during David's usual work hours. That's when I started noticing the voices. At first I thought he was just on video calls with clients or having phone meetings. The voices would start around 10 in the morning and continue intermittently throughout the day. But something felt off about the conversations. They were too animated, too emotional for business calls. One day, curiosity got the better of me. I pressed my ear against the wall that separates our rooms and listened carefully. What I heard made my blood run cold. David was having full conversations with multiple people, but the voices were all his own. He was changing his voice, his accent, even his personality to play different characters. He'd spend hours talking to these imaginary people, discussing their problems, their relationships, their daily lives. The most disturbing part was how detailed these conversations were. He had created entire backstories for each character. There was Margaret, an elderly woman who worried about her grandchildren. There was Tommy, a young boy excited about starting school. There was Catherine, a middle-aged woman going through a divorce. David would switch between these characters seamlessly, responding to himself as if he were having real conversations with real people. He'd comfort Margaret about her health concerns, encourage Tommy about making friends, and give Catherine relationship advice. I started documenting these conversations, writing down the characters and their storylines. Over the course of a week, I counted at least 12 distinct personalities that David regularly spoke with. Each had their own voice, their own problems, and their own relationship with him. The strangest part was how normal David seemed when we interacted. He'd emerge from his room for dinner, make small talk about his work, and act completely ordinary. There was no indication that he'd spent the entire day having elaborate conversations with people who didn't exist. I confronted him about it last night. I asked him directly about the voices I'd been hearing from his room. David went completely pale and started stuttering. He tried to claim he was practicing for voice acting jobs, but when I mentioned specific character names and storylines, he broke down. He admitted that he'd been creating these imaginary relationships for over 2 years. He said it started during the pandemic, when he was feeling isolated and lonely. What began as simple self-talk evolved into these complex, ongoing relationships with fictional people. David explained that these characters had become more real to him than most of his actual relationships. He knew their favourite foods, their childhood memories, their fears and dreams. He'd even created photo albums and social media profiles for some of them. The most concerning part was when he told me that sometimes he forgot they weren't real. He'd catch himself buying Christmas presents for Margaret, or worrying about Tommy's first day of school, as if these were actual people in his life. He's been seeing a therapist now, trying to understand why he created this elaborate fantasy world. But he's also terrified of giving up these relationships because they've become such a central part of his life. He spends more time talking to his imaginary friends than he does interacting with real people. I don't know what to do with this information. David isn't dangerous, and he's not hurting anyone except possibly himself. But living with someone who maintains detailed relationships with a dozen fictional people is unsettling in ways I can't fully explain. That story ends there. The level of detail and emotional investment this person puts into imaginary relationships is genuinely concerning. It's like he created an entire alternate reality populated with people who exist only in his mind. The fact that he sometimes forgets they're not real suggests This goes way beyond simple loneliness into something much more serious. I hope he gets the help he needs, but I can't imagine how strange it must be to live with someone carrying on that elaborate of a fantasy life. Let's move on to our next story, which comes from someone who made a discovery about their neighbour that changed everything. I live in a quiet suburban neighbourhood where everyone minds their own business. My next door neighbour, Patricia, is a retired teacher in her 70s who keeps to herself but always waves when we pass on the street. She has this beautiful garden that she tends to every morning, and her house is always immaculate. About 3 months ago, I started noticing that Patricia was getting a lot of packages delivered. At first, I didn't think much of it because everyone shops online these days, but the deliveries became constant, sometimes 3 or 4 packages a day from different companies. The weird part was that Patricia never seemed to bring the packages inside. I'd see them sitting on her porch for hours, sometimes overnight. When they finally disappeared, I assumed she was just slow getting to them. Then I started noticing people coming to her house at odd hours. Not friends or family members, but strangers who would knock on her door, exchange a few words with Patricia, and leave carrying packages. This happened several times a week, always different people. My curiosity got the better of me, so I started paying closer attention to Patricia's routine. That's when I discovered something that completely changed my perception of this sweet elderly woman. Patricia was running a sophisticated package theft operation. She had somehow figured out how to intercept packages that were supposed to be delivered to other addresses in our neighbourhood. I'm not sure if she was bribing delivery drivers or if she had some other method, but packages meant for houses 3 or 4 streets away were ending up on her porch. The people coming to her house weren't random visitors, they were customers. Patricia was selling stolen packages to people who knew they were buying items that had been taken from other people's deliveries. I watched this operation for weeks, documenting everything I saw. Patricia had turned package theft into a full-time business. She was systematic about it, keeping detailed records of what she had available and scheduling appointments with her buyers. The most disturbing part was how normal she acted about it. She'd tend to her garden in the morning, sort through stolen packages in the afternoon, and meet with customers in the evening. Then she'd wave at neighbours and chat about the weather, as if she wasn't running a criminal enterprise out of her house. I realised that dozens of neighbours had probably been wondering where their packages were, never suspecting that the sweet old lady next door was stealing them. People were missing birthday gifts, medication, important documents. Also, Patricia could make a few extra dollars in retirement. When I finally reported her to the police, they were initially sceptical. Patricia looked like everyone's ideal grandmother, not a career criminal, but when they investigated, they found her house filled with stolen packages and detailed records of her sales. It turned out Patricia had been doing this for over a year and had stolen hundreds of packages worth thousands of dollars. She had a whole network of buyers who knew exactly what they were purchasing. Some people were even placing special requests for specific types of items. Patricia was arrested last week, and the story made the local news. Neighbours are still in shock that someone we all trusted was systematically stealing from us. The investigation revealed that she'd stolen everything from baby formula to prescription medications to expensive electronics. The saddest part is that Patricia didn't seem to need the money. She had a comfortable pension and owned her house outright. When asked why she did it, she told police that she was bored in retirement and enjoyed the challenge of running a business, even if it was illegal. Now, every time I see a package sitting on someone's porch, I wonder if there are other Patricias in the neighbourhood, sweet-looking people running criminal operations right under our noses. That story is over. The image of this grandmother systematically stealing packages while maintaining her perfect neighbour facade is genuinely disturbing. It's terrifying how someone can live a completely double life like that, being friendly and trustworthy to your face while actively stealing from you behind your back. The fact that she did it out of boredom rather than necessity makes it even more unsettling. Sometimes the people who seem the most harmless are hiding the darkest secrets. Our next confession comes from someone who discovered their family had been keeping a massive secret for decades. I'm 28 years old, and I just found out that my entire family has been lying to me about something fundamental for my entire life. This discovery has shattered everything I thought I knew about my identity and my family's history. Growing up, my parents always told me that my grandparents on my father's side had died in a car accident when I was too young to remember them. They said it was too painful to talk about, which is why we never visited their graves or kept photos of them around the house. I accepted this explanation and never questioned it. My mother's parents were very much alive and part of my life, so I didn't feel like I was missing anything significant. Occasionally, I'd ask about my father's side of the family, but the conversations would always get shut down quickly, with comments about how talking about the dead was too difficult. Last month, I was helping my parents clean out their attic when I found a box of documents that had been hidden behind some old furniture. The box contained birth certificates, marriage licenses, and other official papers dating back several generations. As I looked through these documents, I found something that made no sense. There were recent utility bills and bank statements with my grandfather's name on them, dated from just 2 years ago. According to my parents, he'd been dead for over 25 years. I confronted my parents about these documents, and after hours of denying and deflecting, they finally told me the truth. My grandparents aren't dead. They're very much alive and living about 3 hours away from us. The reason my parents cut contact with them wasn't because of death, it was because of money. When I was 3 years old, my grandparents loaned my parents a significant amount of money to buy their house. The agreement was that my parents would pay it back over 10 years with reasonable interest, but my parents never made a single payment. Instead, they moved to a different state and cut off all contact with my grandparents. They changed their phone numbers, didn't leave forwarding addresses, and essentially disappeared from my grandparents' lives. My grandparents tried to find us for years. They hired private investigators, sent letters to old addresses, and even tried to contact us through mutual friends. But my parents had covered their tracks well and managed to avoid being found. The most heartbreaking part was learning that my grandparents had been trying to maintain a relationship with me, specifically. They'd sent birthday cards and Christmas presents to our old address for years, hoping they might eventually reach me. They'd saved money for my college education and had been holding on to photo albums and keepsakes they wanted to share with me. When I asked my parents why they'd stolen from family and then disappeared, they claimed my grandparents were controlling and difficult to deal with. But when I pressed for specific examples, they couldn't provide any. It became clear that they'd simply decided it was easier to disappear than to pay back the money they owed. The worst part was realising that my grandparents had no idea if I was alive, healthy, or happy. They'd missed my entire childhood, my graduation, my wedding, everything, because my parents were too cowardly to face their financial obligations. I tracked down my grandparents' current address and called them last week. The conversation was emotional and difficult. They cried when they heard my voice and told me they'd never stopped hoping they'd find me someday. They're both in their 80s now and in poor health. My grandfather has Alzheimer's disease and doesn't always remember things clearly, but my grandmother is sharp and has kept detailed records of everything that happened. She showed me copies of the loan agreement, documentation of their attempts to find us, and boxes of letters and gifts they'd bought for me over the years. I've been visiting them every weekend since we reconnected. My grandmother has been showing me photo albums from my father's childhood and sharing stories about our family history that I'd never heard. My grandfather has moments of clarity where he recognises me and talks about how much I look like my father did. At my age, my parents are furious that I've reconnected with my grandparents. They claim I'm being manipulated and that I don't understand how difficult the situation was back then. They've threatened to cut contact with me if I continue seeing my grandparents, but I don't care anymore. I'm helping my grandparents pursue legal action to recover the money my parents stole from them. It's a complicated case because of how much time has passed, but we have all the documentation and evidence needed to prove what happened. The saddest part is realising how much time we've lost. My grandmother keeps saying she wishes she could have been there for my childhood, and I wish I could have known them before my grandfather's memory started failing. My parents robbed all of us of decades of family relationships because they were too selfish to pay back money they'd borrowed. That story comes to an end here. The level of selfishness required to steal from your own parents and then disappear with their grandchild is absolutely staggering. These people literally faked deaths to avoid paying back a loan and robbed their child of relationships with loving grandparents. The fact that the grandparents kept sending gifts and saving money for college shows the kind of people they really are. Sometimes the family members you trust most are the ones capable of the most devastating betrayals. Let's transition to another confession that involves a different kind of family deception. My wife has been pretending to have a job for the past 2 years, and I just discovered the truth by accident. I've been married to Lisa for 6 years, and I thought I knew everything about her. She's always been ambitious and career-focused, which is one of the things I love about her. 2 years ago, she told me she got a promotion at her marketing firm that required her to work remotely full-time. I was happy for her because she seemed excited about the new role and the salary increase. Lisa has always been the primary breadwinner in our relationship. I work as a freelance writer, so my income is inconsistent, while she brought in a steady paycheck that covered most of our expenses. When she got this supposed promotion, she said her salary had increased significantly, which explained why we suddenly had more money for vacations and home improvements. Every morning, Lisa would get dressed in business attire, grab her laptop bag, and leave the house around 8:30. She'd come home around 6 in the evening, looking appropriately tired from a day at the office. She'd talk about meetings, difficult clients, and office politics just like any other working professional. The charade was so convincing that I never questioned it. She had answers for everything. Detailed stories about co-workers, complaints about her boss, excitement about upcoming projects. She even showed me emails on her phone occasionally, though I never looked too closely at them. About 3 weeks ago, I was at the grocery store when I ran into Sandra, who used to work with Lisa at the marketing firm. I hadn't seen Sandra in years, so we caught up for a few minutes. I mentioned how well Lisa was doing with her remote position, and Sandra looked confused. Sandra told me that Lisa had been laid off from the company over 2 years ago during a round of budget cuts. She said it had been a big surprise because Lisa was a good employee, but the entire remote marketing team had been eliminated. Sandra assumed Lisa had found another job immediately, since she'd never heard from her after the layoffs. I was stunned but tried not to show it. I made some excuse about Lisa working for a different company now, and ended the conversation as quickly as possible. But my mind was racing with questions about what Lisa had actually been doing every day for the past 2 years. That evening I casually asked Lisa about her day at work, listening more carefully to her responses. The stories she told seemed generic and vague, lacking the specific details that real workplace experiences usually have. She mentioned meetings and deadlines, but never anything concrete or verifiable. I decided to follow her the next morning to see where she was actually going. I felt terrible about spying on my wife, but I needed to understand what was happening. Lisa left the house at her usual time, and I waited a few minutes before following her in my car. She drove to the public library downtown and went inside carrying her laptop bag. I waited in the parking lot for about an hour, then went inside to see what she was doing. I found her in the quiet section, sitting at a table with her laptop open, working on what appeared to be online courses. I watched from a distance as she took notes, watched video lectures, and completed assignments. It looked like she was studying web design and digital marketing. She spent the entire day there, taking breaks to walk around or grab coffee from the library cafe. When I confronted Lisa that evening, she broke down immediately. She admitted that she'd been lying about having a job for the past 2 years. After being laid off, she'd been too ashamed to tell me the truth, so she pretended to still be employed while secretly living off our savings and credit cards. Lisa explained that she'd been using our savings to maintain the illusion of her salary. She'd been paying our bills with credit cards and moving money around to make it look like regular paychecks were coming in. She'd been spending her days at the library, taking online courses, trying to develop new skills that might help her find another job. The financial situation was worse than I'd imagined. Lisa had accumulated over $40,000 in credit card debt while maintaining this deception. She'd been taking cash advances to pay for our vacations and home improvements, all while I believed we were financially secure. The most heartbreaking part was learning how much she'd been struggling with depression and anxiety about unemployment. She'd been carrying this enormous burden alone, too proud and ashamed to ask for help. She said she kept thinking she'd find another job soon and could fix everything before I found out. Lisa had been applying for jobs sporadically, but her confidence had been shattered by the layoffs and subsequent rejections. She'd convinced herself that she was unemployable and that lying was easier than facing the reality of our situation. She'd been trapped in this deception for so long that she didn't know how to get out of it. We're working through this together now, but it's been incredibly difficult. The trust in our marriage has been severely damaged, and we're facing serious financial problems because of the debt she accumulated. Lisa is seeing a therapist to deal with her depression and anxiety, and she's actively job hunting with my support. The hardest part is understanding how someone I love so much could lie to me every single day for 2 years. She looked me in the eye every evening and told me detailed stories about a job that didn't exist. She let me worry about my own inconsistent income, while hiding the fact that we had no steady income at all. I love Lisa, and I want our marriage to work, but I don't know how long it will take to rebuild the trust that's been broken. Every conversation we have now makes me wonder what else she might be hiding from me. The woman I thought I knew so well had been living a completely fabricated life right in front of me. That story ends there. The dedication required to maintain such an elaborate lie for 2 years is honestly staggering. Getting dressed every morning, creating fake work stories, managing finances to hide massive debt, all while your spouse has no clue what's happening. The shame and depression that drove her to this extreme shows how mental health struggles can spiral into deceptions that hurt everyone involved. Sometimes the people we love most are drowning right beside us, and we never even notice. Our next story takes us into territory that makes you question how well you can ever really know someone. I've been secretly recording my therapy sessions for 3 years, and what I discovered has changed everything I thought I knew about mental health treatment. I started seeing Dr. Matthews for anxiety and depression about 3 years ago. He came highly recommended and had excellent reviews online. During our initial consultation, he seemed professional, empathetic, and genuinely interested in helping me work through my issues. The sessions were expensive, but I felt like they were worth it because I seemed to be making progress. Dr. Matthews would give me homework assignments, suggest coping strategies, and help me understand patterns in my thinking that were contributing to my problems. About 6 months into our sessions, I started recording them on my phone. I told myself it was so I could review his advice later and make sure I was implementing his suggestions correctly. I kept the phone hidden in my jacket pocket, and Dr. Matthews never knew I was recording. At first, listening back to the sessions was helpful. I could catch things I'd missed during our conversations and reflect on his insights when I was in a calmer state of mind. But as time went on, I started noticing patterns in his responses that made me uncomfortable. Dr. Matthews would often give me the exact same advice word for word, even when I was discussing completely different problems. He had what seemed like a script of responses that he'd rotate through, regardless of what I was actually telling him about my life. More concerning was how he'd sometimes contradict advice he'd given me in previous sessions. He'd tell me to try one approach to dealing with anxiety, then a few weeks later suggest the complete opposite strategy without acknowledging the contradiction. I started comparing recordings from different sessions and realised that Dr. Matthews wasn't really listening to me at all. He'd ask the same questions in the same order, give the same responses, and assign the same homework, regardless of my progress or changing circumstances. The breaking point came when I noticed that he was browsing social media on his computer during our sessions. I could see the reflection of his screen in a picture frame behind his desk, and he was scrolling through Facebook and Instagram while I was talking about serious personal issues. I decided to test him by telling him a completely fabricated story about a traumatic event that never happened. I made up details about a car accident and described fake symptoms of PTSD. Dr. Matthews responded with his usual generic empathy and assigned me standard homework for trauma recovery. The next week, I told him the story had been completely made up and that I'd never been in any car accident. Instead of addressing why I'd lied or what that might mean for our therapeutic relationship, he just moved on to his next scripted question, as if nothing had happened. I realised that Dr. Matthews was essentially running a therapy mill, going through the motions with patients without providing any real treatment. He was collecting insurance payments for sessions where he wasn't actually engaged in helping people with their mental health issues. I started researching his background and discovered that several former patients had filed complaints with the state licensing board about similar issues. There were reports of him being distracted during sessions, providing generic advice, and failing to remember important details about patients' lives. The most disturbing thing I learned was that Dr. Matthews had been under investigation for insurance fraud. Apparently, He'd been billing for longer sessions than he actually conducted and claiming to provide specialised treatments that he wasn't qualified to perform. I filed a complaint with the licensing board and provided them with recordings of our sessions as evidence. The investigation revealed that Dr. Matthews had been defrauding both patients and insurance companies for years, providing substandard care while collecting full fees. His licence was revoked last month, and he's facing criminal charges for insurance fraud. The investigation found that he'd been doing this with dozens of patients, essentially stealing money, while people believed they were receiving legitimate mental health treatment. The worst part is thinking about all the people who trusted him with their deepest problems and most vulnerable moments, only to discover that he wasn't even paying attention. Some of his patients had been seeing him for years, believing they were making progress in therapy when they were actually just talking to someone who was scrolling through social media. I'm working with a new therapist now, someone who actually listens and provides personalised treatment. But the experience has made me sceptical of mental health professionals in general. I keep wondering how many other therapists are just going through the motions while patients pour their hearts out to someone who doesn't care. The recordings I made probably weren't legal, but they were the only way to prove what was happening in those sessions. Without that evidence, Dr. Matthews would probably still be practicing and taking advantage of vulnerable people who desperately needed real help. That story is over. The violation of trust here is absolutely sickening, because these were people at their most vulnerable seeking help for serious mental health issues. This guy was literally stealing money, while people believed they were getting treatment that could save their lives. The fact that he was browsing social media while patients discussed trauma shows a level of callousness that's hard to comprehend. Mental health treatment requires genuine human connection, and he turned it into a fraudulent assembly line operation. Let's move to another story that reveals how people can hide their true nature behind the most ordinary facades. I work as a night janitor at a large office building, and I've discovered that one of the executives has been living there secretly for over a year. I've been cleaning this 30-storey office building for about 2 years now. It's mostly filled with accounting firms, law offices, and consulting companies. I work the overnight shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m, so the building is supposed to be completely empty, except for security guards and maintenance staff. My routine is pretty standard. I clean each floor systematically, emptying trash cans, vacuuming carpets, and sanitising bathrooms. Most nights, the building is dead quiet except for the hum of ventilation systems and the occasional security guard making rounds. About 6 months ago, I started noticing small things that seemed off on the 23rd floor. There would be coffee cups in trash cans that were still warm, or desk chairs that had been recently adjusted. At first, I thought maybe someone was working extremely late and leaving just before I got to their floor. But then I started finding more personal items. There would be toiletries in the executive bathroom, changes of clothes hanging in supply closets, and food containers that looked like they'd been used for meals rather than just office snacks. The 23rd floor houses Peterson & Associates, a mid-sized consulting firm. I'd cleaned their offices hundreds of times and knew the layout well, but lately one of the corner offices always seemed lived in, even though it was supposed to be empty. I decided to investigate more carefully. I started timing my cleaning of that floor differently, approaching quietly to see if I could catch whoever was staying there. That's when I discovered Richard Peterson. The firm's founder and CEO had essentially moved into his office. The first time I saw him, he was sleeping on an expensive-looking air mattress that he'd set up behind his desk. He had created a makeshift bedroom, complete with pillows, blankets, and a small lamp for reading. When he woke up and saw me, he looked terrified. Richard begged me not to report him to building security or management. He explained that he'd been going through a difficult divorce, and his wife had gotten a restraining order that prevented him from returning to their house. Rather than find an apartment or stay in a hotel, he'd been secretly living in his office. He showed me how he'd been managing this arrangement. He had a mini refrigerator hidden under his desk, a small microwave in his supply closet, and he'd been using the executive bathroom for showering and personal hygiene. He'd even set up a system for doing laundry in the building's utility room. Richard had been incredibly careful about maintaining the illusion that he wasn't living there. He'd arrive at work normally each morning, work his regular schedule, and then simply never leave. After hours, he'd transform his office into a living space, then convert it back to a normal office before other employees arrived. The setup was surprisingly sophisticated. He had blackout curtains that he'd installed to block light from getting out at night, and he'd figured out how to disable the motion sensors in his area so security wouldn't be alerted to movement after hours. Richard explained that his divorce had been financially devastating. His wife had frozen their joint accounts and was demanding half of everything, including his ownership stake in the consulting firm. He couldn't afford both lawyer fees and rent for a new apartment, so living in his office had seemed like a temporary solution. What started as a few nights had turned into over a year of secret residence in the building. Richard had become an expert at avoiding security cameras, timing his movements around guard rotations, and maintaining his professional appearance despite essentially being homeless. The most disturbing part was how this situation had affected his mental health. Richard told me he'd become paranoid and anxious, constantly worried about being discovered. He'd stopped socialising with friends and colleagues because he was afraid someone might figure out his living situation. He'd also been struggling with the practical aspects of living in an office building. He had limited access to fresh food, no proper place to exercise, and was constantly worried about making noise that might alert security or other tenants. Richard offered to pay me to keep his secret, but I told him that wasn't necessary. I felt sorry for him and could see that he was desperate and ashamed of his situation. He seemed like a decent person who'd gotten trapped in circumstances beyond his control. I started helping him in small ways. I'd empty his personal trash separately, so building management wouldn't notice unusual items. I'd let him know if security was doing extra rounds on his floor. Sometimes I'd bring him fresh fruit or other food items that were easier to store in his limited space. But the situation couldn't last forever. Last week, Richard's ex-wife hired a private investigator to track his activities, apparently suspicious about his living arrangements. The investigator discovered evidence of his office residence and reported it to building management. Richard was confronted by building security and management. Yesterday, his lease for office space was terminated immediately, and he was banned from the building. The consulting firm is in chaos because their founder and CEO essentially disappeared overnight. I feel terrible for Richard, but I also understand why the building management had to take action. Having someone living in office space creates liability issues and violates fire codes and zoning regulations. Still, it's heartbreaking to see someone lose everything because of a divorce and end up secretly homeless in their own office. The whole situation makes me wonder how many other people might be secretly living in places where they're not supposed to be, just trying to survive difficult circumstances while maintaining their professional dignity. That story comes to an end. The desperation required to secretly live in your own office for over a year while maintaining a professional facade is genuinely heartbreaking. This guy went from successful business owner to essentially homeless, sleeping on an air mattress behind his desk while pretending everything was normal during work hours. The fact that his divorce drove him to such extreme measures shows how quickly someone's entire life can collapse. Sometimes the executives in corner offices are fighting battles we never see. Our next confession involves someone who uncovered a family secret that had been hidden for decades. I discovered my older brother has been stealing my identity to live a completely different life online, and the extent of his deception is beyond anything I could have imagined. My brother Alex is 32 years old and has always been what you might call a failure to launch. He lives in our parents' basement, works part-time at a pizza place, and has never had a serious relationship or any real ambitions. I'm 26, work as a software engineer, and have generally had my life together since college. About 2 months ago, I started getting friend requests on social media from people I didn't recognise. They were all attractive women who seemed to think they knew me well. Their messages were flirty and familiar, referencing conversations and shared experiences I had no memory of. At first I thought it might be cases of mistaken identity or spam accounts, but the messages were too specific and personal. These women knew details about my job, my interests, and even my family that wouldn't be available to random strangers online. One woman named Rebecca sent me a particularly confusing message, asking why I'd suddenly stopped responding to her texts and whether I was still planning to visit her in Denver next month. She mentioned specific restaurants we'd supposedly talked about going to and referenced inside jokes that made no sense to me. I decided to investigate further and discovered that someone had been using my photos and personal information to create dating profiles on multiple platforms. The profiles used my real name, my actual photos from social media, and accurate information about my career and hobbies. But the personality described in these profiles was completely different from who I actually am. The fake me was described as spontaneous and adventurous, someone who loved travelling and extreme sports. The real me is pretty introverted and prefers quiet nights at home to skydiving or rock climbing. The fake profiles also claimed I was single and looking for serious relationships, when in reality I've been with my girlfriend Hannah for 3 years. Whoever created these accounts had been having detailed conversations with dozens of women, some for months at a time. I started piecing together the timeline and realised these profiles had been active for over 2 years. The person behind them had been maintaining relationships with multiple women simultaneously, sharing fake stories about travels and adventures and making promises about meeting in person that never materialised. The breakthrough came when I found a conversation thread where one of the women mentioned details that only someone in my immediate family would know. She referenced a childhood story about our family dog and mentioned my parents' names and occupations. That's when I realised it had to be Alex. He had access to all my photos through family social media accounts, knew intimate details about my life, and had plenty of time to maintain these elaborate online relationships from his basement setup. I confronted him about it last week, and after initially denying everything, he broke down and admitted to creating the fake profiles. He'd been using my identity to live out a fantasy version of himself, one where he was successful, attractive, and interesting to women. Alex explained that he'd started the profiles during a particularly low period in his life, when he was feeling completely worthless. He said pretending to be me gave him confidence and allowed him to experience relationships he could never have as himself. The scope of his deception was staggering. He'd been talking to over 50 women across various platforms, some of whom he'd been stringing along for years. He'd created elaborate backstories about travels to places he'd never been and achievements he'd never accomplished. Some of these women had developed genuine feelings for who they thought was me. They'd shared personal details about their lives, their dreams, and their struggles, all while believing they were building real connections with someone who cared about them. The most disturbing part was discovering that Alex had been collecting personal information about these women. He had detailed notes about their jobs, their families, their insecurities, and their romantic histories. It felt like he'd been treating these relationships as some kind of psychological experiment. Several women had sent intimate photos, believing they were sharing them with someone they trusted and cared about. Alex had saved all of these images, along with screenshots of private conversations that these women never consented to have preserved. When I demanded that he'd delete everything and come clean to all the women he'd been deceiving, Alex became defensive and angry. He said I didn't understand what it was like to be him, to feel invisible and unwanted. He claimed that these relationships were the only thing that made him feel human. He begged me not to expose what he'd done, saying it would destroy the few connections he had left. But I couldn't let him continue manipulating and deceiving these innocent women who thought they were talking to me. I've spent the past week reaching out to as many of the women as I could find, explaining the situation and apologising for my brother's actions. Most were devastated and angry. Some had already started making plans to visit or meet up with who they thought was me. The hardest conversation was with Rebecca, who had apparently been planning to relocate to my city because she thought we were in love. She'd already given notice at her job and started looking for apartments near where she thought I lived. Alex has since deleted all the profiles, but the damage to these women's lives and trust has already been done. Some of them had turned down real relationship opportunities because they thought they'd found someone special in my fake persona. My parents are horrified and have finally acknowledged that Alex needs serious professional help. He's agreed to see a therapist, but he seems more sorry about getting caught than about the pain he's caused to all these women. The whole experience has made me paranoid about my online presence and worried about what other ways Alex might have been using my identity without my knowledge. I've had to change passwords, update privacy settings, and warn my girlfriend and close friends about what happened. The worst part is knowing that somewhere out there might be women who still don't know they were talking to a fraud, still waiting for messages from someone who never existed in the first place. That story is over. The psychological manipulation here is absolutely chilling, because Alex wasn't just catfishing random people, he was systematically destroying lives using his own brother's identity. These women thought they'd found love, and were making major life decisions based on a complete fiction. The fact that he kept detailed notes and collected intimate photos shows this went way beyond loneliness into predatory behaviour. Some people really will steal anything from family, even your entire identity. Let's move to another story about someone who discovered their seemingly perfect marriage was built on a foundation of lies. My husband of 5 years has been maintaining a secret apartment across town, and what I found there has completely shattered my understanding of who he is as a person. I'm 31, and my husband Michael is 34. We've been together for 7 years total, married for 5, and I thought we had an incredibly strong relationship. He's always been attentive, loving, and completely devoted to our marriage and our 2 young children. Michael works in sales and travels occasionally for work, usually just overnight trips within our state. He's always been very communicative about his schedule and would call me every night when he was away. I never had any reason to suspect he was being unfaithful or dishonest about anything. Last month I was organising our finances when I noticed some charges on our credit card that didn't make sense. There were monthly payments to a property management company that I didn't recognise, along with utility payments for an address I'd never seen before. When I asked Michael about these charges, he seemed genuinely confused and said he'd look into it. He suggested it might be some kind of billing error or identity theft. A few days later, he told me he'd called the companies, and it was indeed a mistake that had been corrected, but the charges continued appearing on our statements. I decided to investigate on my own and discovered that Michael had been renting a 1-bedroom apartment across town for the past 3 years. The lease was in his name only, and he'd been paying rent and utilities with our joint credit card. I drove to the address during my lunch break one day, when I knew Michael was supposedly at work. The apartment complex was nice, but unremarkable, the kind of place a single professional might live. I managed to get the apartment number from the leasing office by pretending to be considering moving there. I sat in my car outside the building for 2 hours, not sure what I was hoping to see, or what I would do if I actually encountered Michael there. Finally, I worked up the courage to go to the apartment door and knocked. No one answered, but I could hear music playing inside. I tried calling Michael's cell phone and heard it ringing from within the apartment. When the ringing stopped, the music was turned down, but no one came to the door. That evening, I confronted Michael directly about the apartment. I told him I knew about the lease, the utility payments, and that I'd been to the building. His face went completely white, and for several minutes he just stared at me without speaking. Finally, he admitted that he'd been renting the apartment, but insisted it wasn't what I thought. He said he'd gotten it as a place to decompress and have some alone time away from the stress of work and family responsibilities. He claimed he'd never brought another woman there, and that he just used it to think and recharge. I demanded to see the apartment immediately. Michael reluctantly agreed, and drove me there that night. When he opened the door, I was shocked by what I found inside. The apartment was fully furnished and decorated, but not like any space Michael had ever created before. The walls were covered with artwork and posters that reflected interests I'd never known he had. There were books about philosophy and spirituality that he'd never mentioned reading. The kitchen was stocked with gourmet cooking ingredients, when Michael barely knew how to make toast at home. But the most disturbing discovery was a walk-in closet filled with clothes that weren't his usual style. There were expensive suits, casual wear, and accessories that looked like they belonged to a completely different person. Everything was organised meticulously, like a curated wardrobe for someone with sophisticated tastes. On the bathroom counter, I found cologne, skincare products, and grooming supplies that were nothing like what Michael used at home. There were also prescription bottles with his name on them for medications I'd never seen him take. The apartment had clearly been lived in regularly. There were personal touches everywhere, photos of places Michael claimed he'd never visited, and a journal filled with his handwriting describing experiences and thoughts that seemed to come from a stranger. As I read through the journal, I realised that Michael had been using this apartment to live as a completely different version of himself. The entries described a sophisticated, cultured man who attended art galleries, read literature, and had deep philosophical thoughts about life. The journal also contained detailed plans for this alternate life. Michael had been researching graduate programs, career changes, and even considering relocating to other cities. He'd been exploring possibilities for a future that didn't seem to include me or our children. Most shocking were entries about feeling trapped in his current life and wondering what would happen if he just disappeared one day. He wrote about envying people who could reinvent themselves and start over somewhere new with a clean slate. When I confronted him with the journal, Michael broke down completely. He admitted that he'd been struggling with his identity for years and feeling like he was living someone else's life. He said the apartment was his way of exploring who he might have been if he'd made different choices. He explained that the clothes, the books, and the lifestyle represented the person he wished he could be, someone more interesting and accomplished than the suburban father and husband he'd become. He'd been spending several hours there each week, sometimes after work and sometimes on weekends when he claimed to be running errands. The most devastating revelation was that Michael had been actively researching how to disappear and start a new life somewhere else. He'd looked into changing his name, getting new identification, and covering his tracks. The journal contained detailed plans for abandoning his current life and becoming this alternate version of himself permanently. Michael insisted that he'd never acted on these plans, and that he loved me and our children. He said the apartment was just a fantasy space where he could imagine different possibilities, not something he ever intended to make real, but I found evidence that suggested otherwise. There were job applications for positions in other states, correspondence with apartment rental agencies in different cities, and research about schools and neighbourhoods far from where we currently live. The betrayal I felt wasn't just about the secret apartment or the money he'd spent without telling me. It was about discovering that the man I'd married and built a life with had been secretly planning to abandon that life and become someone completely different. We're in marriage counselling now, trying to work through this revelation and its implications for our relationship. Michael has agreed to give up the apartment and be completely transparent about his whereabouts and activities going forward. But I don't know if I can ever trust him again, or feel secure in our marriage, knowing that he's capable of maintaining such an elaborate double life. The fact that he'd been planning potential escape routes, while I thought we were building a future together, has fundamentally changed how I see our relationship. The hardest part is explaining to our children why Daddy has been so sad lately, and why Mommy and Daddy have been having so many serious conversations. They're too young to understand the complexity of what's happened, but they can sense that something has changed in our family dynamic. That story comes to an end. The idea of someone maintaining an entire alternate identity, complete with different clothes, interests, and life plans, is genuinely terrifying. This wasn't just having a secret space. This was actively researching how to disappear and abandon his family to become someone else entirely. The fact that he was using their joint credit card to fund his escape planning makes it even more calculating and cruel. Sometimes the person sleeping next to you is dreaming of a life where you don't exist. Our next confession comes from someone who made a discovery about their workplace that changed everything they thought they knew about their job. I work at what I thought was a legitimate research facility, but I recently discovered we've been unknowingly participating in unethical human experimentation for the past 2 years. I'm a research assistant at Meridian Labs, a private facility that conducts studies on human behaviour and psychology. I was hired straight out of college and was excited to work in what seemed like a cutting-edge research environment. The pay was excellent, and my colleagues were all highly educated professionals who seemed passionate about advancing scientific knowledge. Our primary project involved studying stress responses and decision-making patterns in controlled environments. Participants were recruited through online advertisements and were paid well for their time. They'd come to our facility for sessions that lasted anywhere from 2 to 8 hours, during which we'd monitor their physiological responses to various stimuli. The studies seemed legitimate and followed what appeared to be proper ethical protocols. Participants signed detailed consent forms, were debriefed after sessions, and seemed comfortable with the procedures. Everything appeared to be standard psychological research, the kind conducted at universities and research institutions worldwide. My role involved monitoring participants during sessions, collecting data, and helping to analyse results. I worked primarily with Dr. Richardson, the lead researcher who had impressive credentials and seemed genuinely committed to producing valuable scientific knowledge. About 6 months ago, I started noticing some irregularities in our protocols that made me uncomfortable. Participants were sometimes given substances they were told were vitamins or supplements, but the effects seemed stronger than what you'd expect from standard nutritional products. Some participants would become unusually drowsy or experience mood changes that seemed disproportionate to the mild stressors we were supposedly exposing them to. When I asked Dr. Richardson about this, he explained that some people are more sensitive to environmental factors than others. I also noticed that our consent forms were extremely vague about the specific procedures participants would undergo. While they covered general risks and benefits, they didn't provide detailed information about the substances they might be given or the full range of stimuli they'd be exposed to. The breakthrough came when I accidentally accessed the wrong file directory on our shared server. Instead of finding the data files I needed, I discovered a folder containing what appeared to be the real documentation for our studies. These documents revealed that our research was being funded by a pharmaceutical company that was using our facility to conduct unauthorized drug trials. The supplements we'd been giving participants were actually experimental medications that hadn't been approved for human testing. The studies weren't about stress responses or decision-making at all. We were testing the effects of various compounds on cognitive function, emotional regulation, and physical coordination. Some of the substances we'd been administering were potentially dangerous and had known side effects that weren't disclosed to participants. The most disturbing discovery was that several participants had experienced adverse reactions that were documented in files I'd never seen before. Some had developed persistent headaches, memory problems, and mood disorders after their sessions. These reactions were being tracked and analysed, but the participants themselves were never informed about the connection to their exposure at our facility. I found correspondence between Dr. Richardson and executives at the pharmaceutical company discussing how to minimise legal liability while maximising data collection. They were deliberately recruiting participants from vulnerable populations who were less likely to report problems or pursue legal action if they experienced negative effects. The consent forms had been carefully crafted to provide legal protection while revealing as little as possible about the true nature of the experiments. Participants thought they were helping with academic research when they were actually serving as unpaid test subjects for potentially dangerous drug trials. When I confronted Dr. Richardson with this information, he initially tried to deny everything and claimed I'd misunderstood what I'd found. When I pressed him with specific details from the files, he eventually admitted the truth, but tried to justify the deception. He argued that the research we were conducting was potentially valuable and that traditional clinical trial processes were too slow and expensive. He said participants were being compensated fairly and that the risks were minimal compared to the potential benefits of the medications we were testing. Dr. Richardson also threatened my job and my future career prospects if I disclosed what I'd learned. He said the pharmaceutical industry was small and that whistleblowers rarely found employment in research positions afterward. He suggested I should be grateful for the experience and the generous salary rather than creating problems. I struggled with this information for weeks, knowing that reporting it would likely end my career, but feeling obligated to protect future participants from potentially harmful experimentation. I documented everything I could access and made copies of the most incriminating files. I finally reported the situation to the FDA and the Institutional Review Board that supposedly oversees research ethics in our area. The investigation that followed revealed that Meridian Labs had been operating without proper oversight for over 3 years. The facility was shut down immediately, and several staff members, including Dr. Richardson, were arrested on charges related to conducting unauthorized human experimentation. The pharmaceutical company that funded the research is now facing multiple lawsuits from participants who experienced adverse effects. I've been cooperating with federal investigators and providing testimony about what I witnessed during my time at the facility. The legal process is complex and ongoing, but it's clear that dozens of people were exposed to experimental drugs without their informed consent. The hardest part has been